Welcome to an online event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists, a division of the American Scientific Affiliation. My name is Brian Groyle, and I'm president of the biology group. Tonight's event is the third in a series of 9 events that we are hosting on the topic of evolution and creation. The overall goal of this interdisciplinary series is to explore the scientific theory of evolution and the theological implications of the biblical text regarding the doctrine of creation. Presentations will be given by Christians with expertise in geology, biology, astrophysics, paleoanthropology, biblical studies, and theology. Our sincere hope is that by the end of this series, you will see the harmony that exists between science and scripture, especially as it relates to evolution and creation. This evening, we are delighted to have Ryan Bebej as our guest speaker. Ryan is a professor in the Department of Biology at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he has taught courses in anatomy, physiology, and zoology since 2012. He earned his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology with a focus in paleontology from the University of Michigan. His scientific research focuses on the evolution of cetaceans, which are whales, dolphins, and porpoises, evolution from terrestrial ancestors. He is especially interested in the earliest stages of the evolutionary transition and the anatomical modifications that facilitate changes in swimming mode as these animals became increasingly aquatic. He has excavated skeletons of fossil whales at Wadi al-Hitan, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Egypt's Western Desert, and he routinely spends time working in the collections at world-renowned museums. Ryan is also deeply interested in the relationship between science and Christian faith, especially the difficult theological questions that arise when considering evolution. He has been a speaker for the BioLogos Foundation since 2016, was a scholarship in Christianity in Oxford visiting scholar in science and religion during 2018 to 2019, and was selected as a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation in 2023. The title of Ryan's presentation tonight is Introduction to the Science of Evolution, Mechanisms and Evidence of Life's Transformation. Ryan, thank you for joining us this evening.
So thank you to Brian and Carl and Sarah for the invitation to actually be a part of this series. Especially when I look at the list of speakers in this series, I am incredibly humbled to actually be included among that group of people. Some folks that I've admired from afar through their books and presentations for many, many years as I've been trying to grow as both a scientist and as a Christian. Before I get into sort of the meat of my talk, I feel like it's helpful to tell you a little bit more about who I am in terms of my personal background. Brian did a good job of my professional background, but I always think it's helpful to tell folks kind of where I grew up, some of the things that I thought about, and in my own personal journey in studying evolution. So I grew up in a Christian home in north central Illinois, and our family didn't really think all that much about scientific questions and things like that. But there were these implicit assumptions that I think we had about the age of the Earth and about evolution. We certainly thought that the Earth was very, very young and that evolution simply wasn't true, at least beyond sort of some generation to generation things that we might be able to observe in bacteria and things like that. I eventually found my way to Calvin, what was then Calvin College, as an undergraduate. And I was undecided in terms of what I wanted to study at first, but I took a couple of biology courses during my first year. And it was in an animal biology course that I encountered evolution, kind of in the first serious way that I'd really encountered it. And I'll admit to being a bit affronted at first that we were covering evolution at a Christian college. That was something I wasn't expecting. But in what I call a moment of honest self-reflection, I realized that I really didn't know much about evolution and how it was supposed to work. So I really dug in and tried to understand things from a scientific perspective. And I remember being a bit alarmed about how logical it all seemed. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. But then during the next year, during my second year as a student at Calvin, I took a 3-week interim or J-term course that was co-taught by a biologist and a paleontologist. And that covered the history of evolutionary thought and how Christians could respond to some of these different questions that were raised. And it was also there that I encountered whale evolution for the first time in an article that we read for the class. And I was blown away. I was absolutely hooked. I'd never encountered some of these things scientifically before, but I also became just very keenly interested in whether or not these things could actually fit with my Christian faith, which was so important to who I was and how I saw the world. So eventually, I graduated from Calvin and moved on to the University of Michigan, where I entered the PhD program in ecology and evolutionary biology, but with a focus in paleontology, which allowed me to work at the Museum of Paleontology in Ann Arbor. And there I studied under Philip Gingrich, a renowned paleontologist who had actually been one of the key people in studying early whale evolution. As a part of my time there, as Brian mentioned, I did field work at Wadi al-Hatan in Egypt, where I helped to excavate some of these ancient whales. And then after I finished my PhD, I made my way back to Calvin eventually, where I've been a biology professor since 2012. I mostly teach human courses, right? Human anatomy and human physiology to pre-health folks, but I also do teach comparative anatomy and some animal physiology courses as well. And even though I don't do much field work anymore, I continue to do research on fossil whales, often using modern animals for comparison. And that takes me to a number of different museums around the world. You can even see some photos here from a couple summers back where I took a student to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. to collect some data from some modern whale skeletons. And in case you're curious, this is a blue whale lumbar vertebra in that picture. I mean, it's astounding how huge these animals are. So for this particular talk today, I was asked to give an introduction to evolution, covering both the mechanisms of how evolution works and also some different lines of evidence for evolution. And as you might imagine, that is a gigantic topic. It could easily cover in a full semester course, if not an entire master's degree or PhD. So we thought it might help if I had an extra half hour relative to some of the other talks in this series. So that's why you've got me for about 2 hours altogether this evening. What I've done is I've broken up the presentation into two different parts. Part one will focus on what exactly evolution is, as well as some of the major mechanisms by which it occurs. I'll spend a lot of time focusing on the four basic mechanisms that form the backbone of evolutionary theory and key concepts that we might cover in an introductory biology class. But then I'll also talk a little bit about a variety of different mechanisms or additional factors that biologists have come to really appreciate more in recent decades. Once we get through all of that, we'll do a short Q&A session, and then we'll move on to part two. And part two is where I'll focus on some of the evidence for evolution. I'll provide a pretty brief overview of some of the different disciplines that can provide some of this evidence. And then what I often like to do is work through a case study. And I can't think of a better case study than the creatures that I know best, cetaceans. So I'll give some background on cetaceans in general. I'll talk briefly about some historical perspectives on where they came from or where we thought they came from evolutionarily. And then I'll spend the bulk of this part of the presentation actually walking through a number of different lines of evidence from a whole bunch of different disciplines that speak about the evolution of cetaceans from ancestors that actually lived on land. And at that point, we'll have a little bit more time for some Q&A, and then all of us can go to bed after that. I'm pretty sure I'm going to feel exhausted after I've worked through all of this material tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to start part one. And before we actually work through some of these mechanisms of evolution, I think it's important for me as a biologist to define what exactly I mean when I use the word evolution. So I went first and foremost to a textbook. I went to a textbook that's used in a lot of undergraduate curricula as an upper level, like evolution elective by Doug Fatuma and Mark Kirkpatrick. And in this textbook, their definition for evolution, for biological evolution, is that it's simply inherited change in the properties of groups of organisms over the course of generations, right? So that seems like a pretty reasonable textbook definition. We might even consider, in short, what Darwin refers to evolution as at different points in the origin of species, referring to evolution as descent with modification. When I have people ask me, well, what exactly is evolution? I usually simply say that evolution is changes in the genetic makeup of populations over time. That's it. That's sort of what it is at its core. But I know that that word evolution has a lot of other connotations, and it has a lot of things that come to mind for particular people when they hear it. Some people, when they think about evolution as mechanism. They're thinking about the processes that actually render those changes in lineages through time. Well, we see Charles Darwin here alongside Alfred Russel Wallace. So these two individuals made major contributions with their theory of natural selection, a theory that the two of them actually came up with independently of one another. And we'll talk a little bit about natural selection and how that works in a little bit, but we'll also see that there are some other key processes involved as well. Some people, when they think about evolution as history. And what I mean by that is they're thinking about evolution as just being about the fact that life has changed over the course of time. We don't really need to look any farther than the fossil record to see that life was very different in the past in many ways than it is today. Implicit in this idea is also the assumption of common descent or common ancestry, this idea that the different forms of life on this planet are linked in some sort of family tree. That was certainly something that Darwin advocated for. You can see this is the lone figure that was published in The Origin of Species that talks about sort of this connectedness between living things. But I think even Darwin would admit that there may not have been a lot of great evidence for that at the time that he actually published Origin of Species. We can think about evolution as unifying theory. Yeah, we've often probably heard biologists talk about evolution being one of the central theories in all of biology that makes sense of a whole host of different experiments and observations. And this is using the word theory in the true scientific sense of the word, right? So alongside of atomic theory, cell theory, the germ theory of disease, and things like that. This is not simply a hypothesis or a guess. It's a framework that helps to explain a wealth of different experimental data and observations. You might have heard this quote from geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky at some point. He was actually an Orthodox Christian, and he wrote in an article in 1973 that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So some people think about evolution in kind of that broad, grand sense. Others think about evolution as worldview. And I include the ism there in parentheses because that's how I would refer to this. I would call this evolutionism. And this recognizes that there are some people who use evolution to justify their materialistic worldviews and to support their claim that there is no God and that there is no purpose to existence. There are no shortage of examples that I could use for this, but I've included a quote from Richard Dawkins from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, where he wrote that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, I think many of us probably in this webinar tonight would argue that that is ultimately a philosophical or theological claim that they're making and not a scientific one. But I do think it's important to recognize that for some people, when they hear the word evolution, this is one of the things that comes to mind. So even in just this slide, there are a host of topics and also others that would be extremely interesting to discuss and would warrant plenty of discussion from among the folks here. But I'm only really going to be focusing on the first two of these tonight. I'm going to begin by looking at evolution as mechanism and talking about some of the different ways that we think evolution works. That'll be part one. And then in part two, we'll try to work through some of the evidence for evolution as history using cetaceans as our case study. So to begin working through how we think evolution works, I'm going to discuss these four key mechanisms that are often highlighted in textbooks about evolution: natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and mutation. So we'll start with natural selection first. Natural selection, as I mentioned already, was one of the major contributions of Darwin and also was independently derived by Alfred Russel Wallace as well. And when we talk about evolution in a biology class, we talk about how it rests on these four key postulates. Okay, so first, we need to recognize that variation exists among individuals in a population. I've included an image here of some oven birds. That's another fun hobby of mine, is that I am a birder. I love going out and seeing different birds in nature. Ovenbirds are some warblers that we actually see here in Michigan at different times of year. And when you look at specimens like this in a museum, you see often drawers full of different skins from different individuals of the same species. And even though they all superficially look alike, when you look at them closely, they are highly variable in a number of different ways. The second postulate for natural selection is that at least some of this variation is heritable. Now, interestingly, Darwin and Wallace were working before sort of our modern understanding of genetics. So they didn't really have a great mechanism to explain this. They weren't aware of Gregor Mendel's work, even though he was working around the same time as The Origin of Species was published. And it really wasn't until the modern synthesis in the early part of the 20th century that sciences started to blend evolution with a more modern perspective on genetics. Now, beyond that, we need to recognize that some of the variants may lead to greater survival or reproductive success in individuals. And in biological terms, we might say that those individuals would have greater fitness. So, if all of these things are true, right, that there's variation in the population, some of it's heritable, and some variants may lead to greater fitness, then we would suspect that the proportion of individuals with those beneficial genetic variants will actually increase in proportion in the next generation. Now, since Darwin's publication, this has been documented in numerous times in the wild. The one example that I include here is Peter and Rosemary Grant's work. They're husband and wife biologists who spent many years in the Galapagos Islands documenting changes in various features among the finches that were there. And this was just one particular example when they were working on the island of Daphne Major in 1977, that there was a really bad drought. And that drought reduced the number of small seeds that were available on the island for these finches to eat. And what they saw is that many of the finches with the smallest beaks died. And that led to this increase in the average beak size of finches in the years from the years before the drought to the years after the drought, right? So that's just showing some variation in the population. It was heritable, right? Those individuals with bigger beaks had greater success here. And so we saw in a change in the genetic makeup of those populations to be more adapted for the food sources that they were to have on this island. So if I were to summarize natural selection in just one sentence, I could say that heritable variation leads to differential reproductive success. Okay, so that's a good textbook definition. If you wanted to lay it out more poetically, you could use the words of philosopher and environmental ethicist Holmes Rolston III, who once wrote that the cougar's fang has carved the limbs of the fleet-footed deer, and vice versa. That's a quote that I thought is pretty catchy. But I'm also a fan of Gary Larson and of the Far Side comics. And if you believe that a picture with a one-word caption is worth 1,000 words, then maybe you'd prefer this Far Side cartoon that just says dibs, right? You see those carnivores looking at that chubby little deer, and they're ready to select that one out of the population. Now, there are a few things that I think are important to remember as we think about natural selection as a process. First, I think it's important to recognize that it's populations that evolve. It is not individual organisms that evolve. When we're thinking about the evolutionary process, we're looking at these changes happening at the population level. So there's just a cartoon here showing changes in these deer populations through time. And the fur of the deer themselves, the individual deer, isn't changing due to some environmental factor. If we think about those finches, the beaks of those finches weren't getting deeper due to the drought. We're looking at the average characteristics of these populations, of these groups of organisms changing through time due to this differential reproductive success. We also need to recognize that there are different kinds of selection that can exist. If we're looking at a continuum of a particular characteristic, right? So this is looking at some different mice that have different coat colors from light to dark, right? Sometimes one of these extremes may be favored over the other, right? And that would be what we consider to be directional selection, where the dark coat is being favored, or maybe in a different context, the light coat could be favored. Sometimes we might even recognize that both of the extremes of those characteristics actually get favored. So both light and dark get favored for some reason, but it's these intermediate coat colors that don't get favored. That would be what we call disruptive or divergent selection. We can even have cases where both of the extremes are not favored, and it's actually the average coat color that's favored, and that would be what we call stabilizing selection. That tends to increase just the average characteristic within the population. We can even have none of these happening, right? If we were just seeing a distribution like this being selected for, we would call that balancing selection. So there wouldn't be necessarily much change from one generation to another, right? So even when natural selection is happening, there are different forms of selection that can actually be possible. Lastly, here, I just want to mention that natural selection itself is not random, but it's also not predetermined. And the reason for that is that it is very much context dependent. And one of my favorite experiments to talk about here was carried out by John Endler. So he's a Canadian biologist who did a lot of experimental evolution work with little fishes called guppies. And these individual guppies, you can see a picture of one of them here, they have these spots on them. And that spottedness was variable from one fish to another, and it was largely controlled by genetics. And so what he did was he set up these guppies in different artificial ponds under different conditions. So he would put guppies in a pond that had very coarse gravel at the bottom of it, and that also had a predator present in the water. And what he found is that over multiple generations, the fish that had these larger spots on them tended to proliferate more, presumably because it gave them good camouflage against the coarse gravel. And so it allowed them to hide from these predators a little bit better. In a parallel experiment, he put the same types of fish in a tank that had fine gravel at the bottom with a predator. And over there, he saw that over multiple generations, guppies with the smaller spots actually proliferated, presumably because it gave them better camouflage against that fine-grained background. And this is where it just blows my mind that he set up another set of experiments with the same gravel, but without predators. And in the coarse graveled tanks, the fish that had the smaller spots actually proliferated, presumably because they stood out against the background, so it was easier for them to attract mates. And then in the fine-grained tanks, it was the fish with the larger spots that proliferated, right, without the predator there, again, because they presumably stood out against that background from their mates. So I look at experiments as demonstrating how natural selection is not really a random process, but that the ecological and environmental pressures are so important in dictating the outcome of natural selection through time. So that's my very, very brief overview of natural selection. And I hope that some of you are asking the question, well, if natural selection isn't random, can there be random changes that occur with evolution? Absolutely. That's where this phenomenon called genetic drift comes in. When we're talking about genetic drift, we're talking about changes in the frequencies of these genetic variants from one generation to another purely due to chance, right? We might think about these fluctuations as being due to random deviations or to sampling error. Like if you flip a coin 100 times, the results will likely not be 50 heads and 50 tails. There's just some variation or sampling error that happens there. And different evolutionary biologists can do different simulations of drift to try to get a sense for the potential range of outcomes. So this figure over here is modeling the change in the frequency of a particular genetic variant in 8 different populations that are all a population size of 400 individuals. And so you can see that after 100 generations, on the low end, that particular variant might only be present in 30% of the population, or it might be present in as much as 80% of the population. So this is kind of the range of outcomes, just thinking about how these can fluctuate due to chance. These sorts of changes are considered random with respect to fitness. There is no selection happening when we're talking about genetic drift. This is just variable changes over time. This sort of change happens in every single population in every single generation, right? These sorts of fluctuations are always happening. But interestingly, the effects tend to be much more pronounced when we're looking at smaller populations. So here we're looking at some simulations running over 100 generations with a population size of 4 rather than 400. And what you notice is that variance can very easily become fixed, where every single individual in the population has it, or variance can be completely lost very early in a small population, and this is due solely to random processes, okay? But there can be other forms of genetic drift in addition to these random sampling things that happen every generation. Sometimes we see larger random events that can impact drift as well. And I'll talk about 2 examples of these. One of these is what we call the founder effect. And the founder effect describes when there are changes that occur when there is a new population that's established that's not exactly representative of the population where they came from. So you have a small group of individuals immigrating to a new area, for instance, like an island. And when things like that happen, they rarely represent their source population perfectly. Just looking at this simple model with these little balls or these little marbles, right? You've got blue, red, and purple in the initial population. And if we immigrate to a new location, you might miss some of those genetic variants just due to that small number moving from place to place. We could also talk about real world examples as well. So in 1995, there were 2 major hurricanes that swept through the Caribbean, and fishermen on the island of Anguilla actually noticed a raft of these downed logs and floating debris that carried at least 15 of these green iguanas to the beach. And this is a species that had never been present on Anguilla before. But within 2 years, it was clear that those animals had actually formed a breeding population there. If we were to look at the genetics of that population, it almost certainly would have had a different set of genes or different frequencies of these genetic variants compared to the source population because it was just a small number of animals that got there. That's an example of the founder effect. Another example that we could talk about is what's called a genetic bottleneck. And this happens when there is a sudden reduction in the genetic diversity of a population. Okay. Common causes here can be disease outbreaks, natural disasters, or human activities in the case of non-human organisms. And what happens is we have a relatively small number of individuals that are spared from those causes, and they are left to establish the next generation, but they have far less genetic diversity than the original population had. So again, a real world example here involves people on Pingalap Atoll. This was around 1775 that there was a major typhoon that struck this atoll in Micronesia in the South Pacific, and it killed most of the people that were living there. Only about 20 people survived. And among those individuals, at least one of them carried a genetic variant that causes very poor vision and nearly complete color blindness. So this is a condition called achromatopsia. In most populations around the world, this variant is exceedingly rare, less than 1% of the population. But today on this island, 5% of people have 2 copies of that gene variant, and over 20% of the population has at least 1 copy of that genetic variant. So this is an example of how we can drastically change the genetic makeup of a population due to a genetic bottleneck. So when we're thinking about founder effects and bottlenecks, we're thinking about populations actually losing genetic diversity, and that can actually be detrimental to a population's ability to adapt to future environmental change. So how can we potentially restore some of that genetic diversity? Well, that's where this concept called gene flow comes in. Gene flow involves the movement of genetic variants between different populations. And this happens when individuals are able to move from one distinct population to another one and start to interbreed with individuals in that second population. Again, these types of genetic changes are typically random with respect to fitness. These will not necessarily be, new variants that increase the second population's ability to survive and reproduce. But what it does tend to do is counteract the effects of both selection and drift. So these actually help to make these two different populations more similar to one another rather than being different. Okay. And so this does impact how populations are actually changing through time, even if it might be counteracting some of these other changes that we have talked about. But with all of this discussion of genetic variance, whether it be thinking about natural selection, thinking about genetic drift, thinking about gene flow, we really haven't talked about where those variants come from. And that's where mutation comes in. But as I was starting to put together the slides for this part of the talk, I realized that it's really hard to talk about mutation without a very, very brief overview of DNA and its role in organisms. I can't assume that everyone knows kind of the basics here, so I'll try to do this very quickly. So DNA, as you probably know, is basically a molecular instruction book for how to build and run a living thing. You might have heard it described as a twisted ladder before. The sides of that ladder are made up of sugars and phosphates. And then the rungs of the ladder are made up of these nitrogen-based bases that pair up with one another. So you have cytosine that pairs up with guanine for some rungs, and thymine, which pairs up with adenine for other rungs. In cells, the DNA that's there is used to construct a related molecule called RNA. And then that RNA is used as a little scaffold or a little list or instruction book to construct proteins out of amino acids. Every 3 rungs or every 3 base pairs codes for a single amino acid. And those amino acids then are strung together to form these complex 3-dimensional proteins that basically carry out all sorts of metabolic activities that allow for life. So when we have changes to the DNA, that causes changes in the RNA, which can cause changes in the amino acid sequence, which can change the structure and function of the protein, right? So that's sort of how we're looking at fundamental changes in the DNA changing what happens in these organisms. And anytime we see those changes occur, those are what we call mutations. Every single time you have a cell divide, right? So one cell to create 2 cells, it has to copy its DNA to do that. And every time a cell divides and replicates its DNA, there are genetic mutations that occur. There are places where the DNA gets miscopied. How much or how often that happens, the mutation rate can differ between organisms. It can even differ between different parts of the genome. The environment can affect this. You might think about how toxic waste might increase mutations in particular cases. But every time a human makes a new sperm or a new egg, those cells will actually carry about 30 mutations scattered through the genome. Where those occur in the genome is typically random, and that's where many biologists see unpredictability in evolution. I've got a chart here, a table that shows different kinds of mutations. I'm just looking at my time and thinking that I should probably move a little bit quicker here. But I'll try to summarize briefly that there can be mutations that actually don't change the protein at all. Those are what we call silence mutations. But then there can be other mutations that can lead to subtle changes. There are some mutations that can lead to absolutely major changes. And these changes in the structure of a protein can be detrimental. They can have negative effects on the organism. They can be what are called neutral, meaning they have no changes on the fitness of the organism, or they can sometimes actually be beneficial changes for those organisms as well. We can even think about mutations happening at a higher level as well. We can think about them happening at the chromosome level. And again, I'll try to go through this briefly just to save on time. We can have whole genes that get deleted. We can have whole genes that get duplicated. Those are really interesting because they actually allow the individual to have a functional copy of the gene and a copy of the gene that can accumulate more mutations. So you might have a novel variation of that gene that arises. We can also change the order of genes on a chromosome. That can be what we call inversion. And sometimes we even see whole chromosomes either splitting into multiples. We see separate chromosomes fusing together. We can even see whole genome duplication, where from one generation to another, we double the number of chromosomes in a particular organism. That's actually fairly common among plants. And so, through this combination of both gene and chromosome level mutations, there are new genetic variants that are introduced every generation. Those mutations, again, can be considered random. They can be beneficial, neutral, or detrimental. But there is no well established, agreed upon mechanism among all biologists that actually enables the environment to select which mistakes get made when copying the genes. There are some folks that have suggested some possible sorts of directed mutation that might occur in certain circumstances, but I'd say as a whole, a lot of biologists might not be agreeing with that at this point. Okay. All right. So, a few important things to consider with mutations before we move into some of our other mechanisms here. First, right, that the mutations are the ultimate source of new genetic variants in a population, that they're generally considered random with respect to fitness. And I would say that mutations alone are usually inconsequential in changing frequencies of a particular genetic variant in a population. And it's because this mutational change happens too slowly. But when we combine them with natural selection, drift, and gene flow, we see that mutations can play a more important role in evolution. So, those are the four key basic evolutionary mechanisms that we would cover in an introductory biology class. But something that I think many of us have learned in our careers is that things are rarely as simple as we initially learn them to be. I certainly think that these four mechanisms are probably the key processes at work in the evolution of life on this planet. But we now have a much greater understanding of many other phenomena that impact evolution as well. So I'm going to very briefly highlight just a handful of other concepts that are at play, and then I'll pause for a little bit to take some questions, and hopefully that might be a chance for you to get a little bit more detail about some of these things if I go a little bit quickly through them. So first, I'll mention what I call genetic draft. I like that because it plays off of drift a little bit. Some folks might call this genetic hitchhiking. And this process occurs when there is a gene under strong selection that actually causes genes nearby on the same chromosome to spread through the population, even if they're not necessarily beneficial, right? So one of the examples that we could talk about here actually relates to corn. Corn is a domesticated plant in Central America. The wild plant is called teosinte, and farmers bred these plants to be the most productive, and that generated strong selection on particular traits. But as they did that, the growth form of the plant actually changed. Teosinte is a bushy plant. Corn, as you know, grows in a single stalk. And we now know that this difference is actually largely due to a single mutation in a gene that was close on a chromosome to a gene that was associated with this increased productivity. So you can see particular genetic variants increasing in a population simply because they're close to a different gene that's actually being strongly selected for. So that's what we'd call genetic draft or genetic hitchhiking. We could talk about non-random mating or sexual selection. And this occurs when we see an increase in the frequency of seemingly maladaptive traits due to their attractiveness to the opposite sex. One of the classic examples here is peacocks, right? Peacocks and peahens are these dimorphic birds, especially with regard to tail feathers. And those spectacular tail feathers on the males make flight more difficult. They probably attract more predators, but they're eminently attractive to the female birds, so they actually enhance the male's reproductive success. So there's this almost certainly this interplay between simple survival and mating success. And so as long as there is a greater reproductive advantage that can outweigh the decrease in survival, then there actually is an overall fitness benefit to traits like this. We could talk about epigenetic inheritance as well. I know that the geneticists and molecular biologists in the audience have probably thought a lot more than I have as a paleontologist about these things. But epigenetic inheritance occurs when offspring inherit new traits from their parents without actually genetic changes. And what we see is that you can have chemical changes to DNA that aren't changing the genes, or you can have changes to the histones, which are the proteins that DNA wraps itself around to help form chromosomes. And offspring can actually inherit some of those chemical changes from their parents. So, a real world example here would be wild radish, right? So, a plant that when it's eaten by caterpillars, there are actually chemical defenses that get initiated in the plant that result in the addition of these methyl groups onto the DNA. And then those epigenetic changes are actually passed down to the next generation, causing the chemical defenses in this radish plant's offspring to actually have some of these induced chemical defenses as well. So this is a phenomenon that's fairly recent in terms of genetics, and it's generated a lot of excitement among evolutionary biologists because it might allow for the inheritance of some acquired characteristics from one generation to another. But there have been studies that have shown that these sorts of changes, while they may be useful in the short term, they often do not appear to have really long-term consequences because the changes may be lost after a few generations. We could talk about cultural inheritance as well. And this occurs when traits are actually transmitted to new generations by behavior or by teaching and learning. We could certainly think about a lot of examples within human, ancestry where culture has helped to pass these things on. As a birder, I could talk about white-throated sparrows as well. We're starting to see these in Michigan here right now as well. And they teach one another songs from generation to generation. And we've actually seen a variant in one of these songs rapidly spread across Canada and the northern US in less than 20 years. And so birds are singing different songs across much of the range now than they were just 20 years ago. I'm fond of talking about orcas as well as a cetacean person. You might have heard about how different groups of orcas actually prefer different foods, and they actually utilize different hunting strategies as well. Populations around the Antarctic actually use wave washing to knock seals and penguins off of these ice floes into the water. There are populations of orcas off of Argentina that temporarily beach themselves to catch sea lions and seals. There are populations off of Norway that use bubbles to herd fish into these dense bait balls that they then swim through to catch the fish. And in New Zealand, there are some that have learned to trap rays on the seafloor and immobilize them before eating them. And it's clear that these behaviors in orcas are actually taught from the adults of one generation to the offspring of the next. And so it's fascinating here that we can think about some of these traits and behaviors actually being transmitted between individuals that aren't even necessarily closely related to one another. I'm going to go briefly through a few things here. I'm going to try to do this in the next 5 minutes, Brian, so a little shorter Q&A, but I think I can do it. We could talk about phenotypic or developmental plasticity. And this occurs when you have an individual's physical characteristics that change in response to environmental factors rather than genetics, right? So this means that you can have a given set of genes that can actually be expressed in different ways depending on the environment. Okay, so I'm not going to work through this example here, but maybe this is something I could talk about in the Q&A time. But this is fascinating because sometimes the environment itself can induce different characteristics without necessarily having to generate a new gene to have that new characteristic. The last few things I want to mention here briefly refer to a few what I would call different movements that have happened within evolutionary biology in the past several decades that think about how evolution can be a little bit more of a broader set of ideas than we might initially suppose. One of these movements that's been around for quite a while now is what we call Evo-Devo for short. That's short for evolutionary developmental biology. And this is a field that studies evolutionary changes in the developmental bases of physical characteristics. So folks that are doing Evo-Devo types of work are thinking about questions like, how can changes in development, right, the developmental process from egg to offspring, how can changes in development give rise to different physical characteristics? Or what is the role of development in enhancing evolutionary change? Or maybe in some cases of constraining evolutionary change? They might talk about different concepts like heterochrony, where you might have a change in the rate or change in the timing of a developmental event and how that can impact what the adult organism is like. That would be true in cases where we have things like axolotls, where we actually retain larval characteristics in the adult form. We could also talk about a concept like heterotopy, which is a change in the spatial positioning of a structure. For instance, when you have bones forming in new places, right? Looking at an armadillo like this, where you actually have bone developing within the skin to form these osteoderms. So this sort of field as a whole is really speaking to the importance of gene regulation, how simply controlling when and where a particular gene gets expressed can have a major impact on the physical characteristics of that organism and on its adaptation to its environment. I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker, and I can sort of unpack this a little bit more during the Q&A time if you would like. Another movement that you might have heard of in the past couple of decades is what we call the extended evolutionary synthesis. This was promoted really as early as the 1950s, but it didn't become really conceptualized formally until the past 15 or 20 years. And what these folks would promote is the idea that the modern synthesis of the early 20th century, while it's important, there are other causative factors in evolution that we've come to appreciate that aren't really accounted for very well there. And so we need to sort of extend that modern synthesis to include some of these other ideas, to augment some of the key things that the modern synthesis laid out. So this includes some key concepts like constructive development, where we see development as a process where organisms shape their own development by responding to and even causing changes in both their internal state and the external environment at the same time. Also, things like reciprocal causation, where there are causal effects of the environment on the organism and causal effects of the organism on the environment as well. So these things are kind of in this constant feedback loop with one another. And folks that are a part of this group would be researching things like developmental biases, the idea that variation in physical traits isn't necessarily random or as random as one might predict. Based on the seeming randomness of mutations, there might be certain characteristics that develop more frequently or more easily than others, perhaps due to the way that the genome is structured. Also ideas like niche construction, where an organism is modifying its place within the ecosystem, right? And you might even be able to modify the ecosystem in ways that causes other organisms to evolve. So again, this constant feedback between the two. I would say that individuals that are working within this paradigm are probably still on board with a lot of the key evolutionary principles I started out with. They just don't think that that includes everything we need to consider, right? So we have these other phenomena that we need to use to augment the key principles that came out of the modern synthesis. The last group I'll mention here, and then we'll move into the Q&A, is one that's even more recent than the extended evolutionary synthesis. What you might have heard of the third way of evolution, really launched in about 2014 by James Shapiro and others. And they argue that the current model of evolutionary theory that's arisen out of the modern synthesis just does not account for many of the phenomena that we are now aware of, especially at the cellular and molecular levels. They will emphasize some of the same ideas that we see promoted by the extended evolutionary synthesis, but they have some additional things that they may emphasize as well, including things like Shapiro's natural genetic engineering that proposes that that different cellular systems can actually alter their DNA in response to particular environmental stimuli, so that would allow for more rapid adaptive evolutionary change. And where I would say this differs from the extended evolutionary synthesis is that I think it really seeks to replace the current evolutionary framework rather than expanding upon or augmenting it. I think some of these folks would see natural selection as a process that's more of secondary importance rather than primary importance. So that's where I'd see that this group is a little bit different than the majority of evolutionary biologists in terms of the emphases that they put on some of these evolutionary mechanisms. So again, just trying to stay on task here. So this is a brief summary of part one, right? That most evolutionary biologists posit that selection, drift, gene flow and mutation are the primary drivers of evolutionary change. But I think it's clear, and I don't think there would be evolutionary biologists that disagree with this at all. There are many other mechanisms that play some role in the change of organisms over the history of this planet. Where they differ is, I think, where they place their emphases and where they would argue are the most important mechanisms versus more subsidiary or secondary mechanisms.
So the first question relates to, um, I think, is getting at whether it seems plausible that the amount of genetic diversity that exists in the human population today um, could be explained by the population of humans starting with two individuals, Adam and Eve. Um, so what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so I'm answering this question from the position of somebody who's not a geneticist, right? I'm someone who studies the human body quite a lot. I teach a lot of anatomy and physiology, and I've gotten to study a little bit some of the history of human evolution as well. Um, my understanding of the genetic data is that it is difficult to account for the amount of genetic variation that we see in the human population today. If we're thinking about a very, very small population, thinking about all the way down to two individuals just several thousand years ago. But I will admit to being a person who is focused more on zoology and on the evolution of non-humans, that I don't know that genetic data particularly well for humans. But this is from the reading that I have done for the people who have done that work. I think it's difficult to account for the variation that we see in the population today from a population that would have been that small that recently in the past.
Okay. Next question. Um, there have been questions raised about the source of information in the genome. How do you understand the origin of information? It has been argued that the environment is the source of much of the genome.
That's a really good question, and a question that I don't know that I feel particularly well equipped to answer as somebody who's not a molecular biologist. Um, Certainly, I feel like when we look at how I think that the evolutionary paradigm that I worked through, I think does a very good job of working through um, how things have changed, right, in terms of genetic variation, in terms of changes in protein structure that are allowing for some of these different functions and things like that. But I think you have to have a different framework if you're thinking about the origin of that information. Um, and that's something where I think you really need to bring in people who have really strong background in chemistry and things like that to think through some of those things. When I was an undergraduate at Calvin, shortly after I took organic chemistry, I did an honors project trying to think through some of the different mechanisms that had been proposed for where some of these original things came from, right? So how do you go from non-living chemicals to living things, right? Where is the source of that information, that genetic information? And there are all kinds of different mechanisms that folks have tried to think through. And my impression is that some of them have some ideas that are quite plausible, but they also have some difficulties, right? And some things that they can't necessarily account for. Um, yeah, and so my sense is that I don't know that I have a particular mechanism that I think is most plausible out of some of these. Um, but I also wouldn't necessarily doubt that we might be able to figure that out at some point. And there may be aspects of the ancient Earth that we don't have quite right, where certain characteristics of the environment might have been different than we have proposed in the past that might allow things to work slightly differently. And there may be even some chemical mechanisms that we don't quite have a good grasp on yet that we may be able to discover at some point. But for me, whether or not we've got a good chemical explanation for the origin of this information and where it came from or not, doesn't impact for me my faith in any way, one way or another. I don't necessarily need a mystery at the history of life to sort of indicate that God was active there. I would be equally as excited if God is able to inspire people to figure out ways that that might have happened, and that we can gain some insights into where the origin of that information came from. So that's all a very long-winded answer, Brian, for me saying, I don't know. I mean, these
Yeah.
are things that, not being a molecular biologist, I have probably as many questions as some of the folks in the audience about some of those things.
Well, certainly the issue of the origin, the original origin of the information is kind of a black box. Um, but once some information exists, I mean, molecular biologists would point to things like gene duplication followed by divergence as, how you can get gene families, for example.
Right.
People like Walter Gilbert would talk about the exon shuffling hypothesis, noting that proteins have different functional domains, and so you could get mixing and matching of different combinations of exons
Hmm.
in different genes to create novel assemblies of different proteins that have different functional domains, that are highly conserved domains in different proteins, and
Right.
and acquire unique combinations of functions. Um, um, Sarah Gall is another cellular molecular biologist. Do you have anything to add to that about sources of information? We could obviously include things like horizontal gene transfer, where new genes can enter a species from another species altogether. Um, Sarah, did you want to propose any additional thoughts?
Um, y yeah, no.
Okay,
Not at this point. Thanks.
Well,
okay,
even interestingly here too, I read a paper recently, and many people may or may not be aware that we have viral DNA in our genomes, right? We have
absolutely,
lots of DNA in our genomes that were originally from retroviruses
right.
that infected some of our ancient relatives and put their genetic information in our chromosomes. And sometimes that can even be co-opted. So there's a particular gene that is very likely a retroviral gene that's critical in the development of the placenta, of the human
That's correct.
placenta during
Yeah,
development. Because what we see is that cells actually fuse together um,
mhm,
during the course of that placenta development. And the gene that's actually allowing for that to happen very likely came from a retrovirus.
good example. All right, let's move on to another question. Um, have modern genetics changed any of the classic taxonomy? As an example, three major types of mollusks look very different. Bivalves, gastropods, cephalopods have some similar characteristics, but their overall body morphologies are very different. Do they share any common genetics?
Yeah.
Brachiopods look more like bivalves than do cephalopods, but have classically been placed in a different phylum. Or can we recover genetic data from dinosaur fossils that confirm that they are more related to birds than the earlier thoughts that they were reptiles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that in many cases, genetics have confirmed our taxonomic sort of organization, which is really impressive, right? Thinking about the fact that a lot of these individuals working centuries before we knew what genes and DNA were able to actually figure out how, what organisms were more closely related to others. There are certainly many cases where genes have sort of thrown some of those trees into disarray a little bit, and where you might see conflict between what a morphological taxonomy might look like versus a genetic taxonomy. And there might be years or even decades of debate among the specialists about the proper ways to classify things. Certainly, I think it's been fascinating for me as I've thought about mammals, as I've thought about vertebrates more broadly as well. I can't speak to the invertebrate examples very well, like like was mentioned in the question, but often we see convergence, right? So that's a phenomenon I didn't really talk about at all, where we see similar environmental constraints or similar connection or similar pressures, right, on organisms to cause them to evolve into very similar body forms or very similar lifestyles. I often think about, working with cetaceans, thinking about dolphins and how a dolphin is shaped, and thinking about an ichthyosaur, right, which was a marine reptile that's been extinct for millions and millions of years that had a very similar body plan, a very similar lifestyle to a dolphin. And you think about the constraints there and the selection pressures. It's because moving through water has very physical things that dictate you're not going to be able to move through the water efficiently unless you're this shape. So certain solutions work again and again and again. So you see organisms that are not closely related actually converging on the same body plans, the same lifestyles, because it is what works. And selection sort of dictates that those body plans may have arisen multiple times. As we've studied the genetics on some of these things, we actually see similar genetic pathways often operating as well. So one example I could mention briefly here is limblessness, right? So tetrapod animals are four-legged animals, right? And you can think of many examples of tetrapods that have lost their limbs. So you have snakes, you have other legless reptiles that actually aren't snakes. You have little legless amphibians called cecilians, not the ones from Sicily. It's spelled with a C, not an S. And you can think about things like dolphins and whales. These are all organisms that have lost their hind legs. And when you look at the genetic mechanisms that cause that change to take place, they're often very similar. They're often using some of the same genes. The mutations are different, but the outcomes are the same. They're changing that developmental plan so that those hind limbs don't actually develop. So genetics can provide lots of cool insights that I think align with some of the preconceived wisdom of many centuries, but also give us new insights into things that we never probably would have been able to predict.
Okay, we'll do one more question that's been proposed. Is there a point in the life history of an organism or tissue in the anatomy when or where mutations make the most difference? Does it need to happen early in gestation, in the parent's gametes, etc.? I think he may be getting at issues related to like developmental control switches or something like that.
Yeah, so certainly any changes, any genetic mutations that happen in the production of gametes are crucial because those are the only ones that can be passed to the next generation, right? So any type of mutation that happens like in a body cell somewhere in an already formed individual is going to be more inconsequential because you're not passing that mutation on to the next generation. You could potentially, as an adult, have a mutation in the germ cells, right, that give rise to the gametes as well. So there are a few different levels where those mutations can happen. But you could hypothetically have mutations that happen very early in development, kind of at an early stage, that then could potentially be passed on to the vast majority of cells in the body of an organism. But if you, without seeing the question, the person asking it sounds like they're right to assume that changes that happen early in development can have more profound consequences on the physical characteristics of that organism for sure. And so that can potentially cause larger scale changes to happen from one generation to another. But there's probably also greater capacity there for really detrimental things happening during the development as well that might cause that particular embryo to not be viable if certain mutations happen very, very early in their development.
Okay, I think we need to start the second half of your talk. So go ahead and cue up
All right.
the slides for that part.
So I think all the stuff I talked about in the first part of this lecture is super interesting. But this is the stuff that I'm going to get really excited about, right? So hopefully I came across as kind of excited and interested in the stuff we were doing, but I love talking about whale evolution. And so you're going to get to hear quite a bit of that over the next little while. So we've been talking about these different mechanisms for evolution and how there's a little bit of debate among different people about some of what the primary mechanisms might be. But among the majority of biologists, I really don't think there's much debate at all about the idea that living things on this planet have evolved over millions, maybe even billions of years, and that they're linked together in some sort of tree of life. But I know that that's not necessarily the case for everyone, especially among some Christians, because that was the environment that I grew up in. So, what I'd like to do in part two of the lecture is talk about some of the evidence for evolution as history. What pieces of data do we find that give us, in evolutionary biology, such confidence that biological evolution has happened in our planet's history, even these very profound, large-scale evolutionary changes from one way of living to another? So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to briefly highlight some of the disciplines that contribute evidence for evolutionary change. And again, I'm going to go through these kind of quickly just to make sure we've got time to focus in on the case study. All right. The first discipline, and the one that I'm trained in, I'd say, is paleontology, and I'm going to include geology here as well, because it's the fossil record that really gives us the only direct evidence that life on this planet was very different in the past, sometimes vastly different than it is today. What really speaks to the evolutionary process from paleontology, though, is I think the pattern of change that we actually see when we look at multiple species that are closely related to one another and how they are changing across time. So we could look at a number of different real world examples, the origin of the first land vertebrates or tetrapods you see illustrated here, from fully aquatic ancestors. One of the questions talked about the origin of birds from theropod dinosaurs. These are all really great examples. And if I want to just mention geology briefly, the geological context in which those fossils are found is really important too. It not only helps provide us with a temporal framework for studying the changes we see, but it also gives us an environmental context that might tell us something about the ecologies of these creatures as well. Related to paleontology for me is also comparative anatomy, because I feel like when I look at how modern organisms are put together, I see the evidence of common ancestry there, even when I'm not even thinking about the fossils. So when I'm looking at the different limbs of mammals, right, from a human arm to a cat limb to a whale fin to a bat wing, I see the same underlying architecture despite really drastic differences in external appearance and function. So we might talk about these having homologous structures inherited from a common ancestor. That, to me, by itself does provide some compelling evidence for common ancestry. We could talk about developmental biology as well, right? Thinking about evo-devo and trying to understand the processes that actually give rise to these different anatomical features. One of my favorite examples when I teach comparative anatomy is looking at the development of the inner ear, right? So the little ear bones within marsupial mammals, and how the developmental stages actually mirror the presumed evolution of those structures, where we actually see those ear bones as a part of the lower jaw early in development, and how as development progresses, they actually migrate into the middle ear. We could look at the development of fins and limbs as well. So we could look at like modern lungfishes and understand how their fins develop, comparing that to how the limbs of things like salamanders might develop to help us understand how there can be slight changes in those processes that might have allowed for the development of limbs with fingers from fish fins. We could talk about genetics, right? The things that are often driving these developmental processes, and we can see evidence for the evolution of organisms from genes or different aspects of molecular biology as well. You're seeing here an image from a paper that was actually published in 1982 that demonstrates what many have known for quite a while, that chromosome structure in humans seems to imply a chromosome fusion event at some point in our history. So you can compare the structures of humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutan chromosomes and see what looks to be pretty compelling evidence that humans had two chromosomes that are present in other primates actually fusing together at some point in our ancient history. We could even talk about fields like biogeography, which is the discipline that studies where species are distributed around the world, because sometimes even data from disciplines like this would be hard to explain without evolution and common descent. So I talked about Alfred Russel Wallace in the first part of the talk, the co-discoverer of natural selection, and his main insights actually came from his time spent in Malaysia, where he discovered distributions of animals on these different islands that really only made sense in the context of them evolving either from Australian animals or from animals in Southeast Asia. So I could continue along a path like this for the whole talk, right? Like if I wanted to dive into more details with evidence from fossils and evidence from genes and evidence from development for common ancestry. But I've intentionally tried to introduce to you like disconnected examples. That's often what we see in textbooks, even when we're reading about evolution. We'll see an example of, this particular transition for genetics, this particular transition for fossils, and so on. But when we do that, I actually feel like we lose something really important. Because what that prevents us from seeing is how there can be multiple lines of evidence from different independent fields, all for one particular case, and how those lines of evidence can actually often converge on a single explanation. And when I discovered that as a student, that's when I really started to see evolution as a really, really compelling idea. So that's what I want to do for the rest of this talk. And I'm going to use my favorite group of animals as a case study to demonstrate the explanatory power of evolution. So we're going to talk about cetaceans. I'm going to do a little bit of a background on them first, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'll spend just a few minutes talking about some historical perspectives about where we thought whales came from evolutionarily. And then I'll spend most of this part of the talk working through some different lines of evidence from different disciplines that speak to where exactly whales came from. Okay? So you're probably aware, if you've been, on the web and reading books, that in recent years that the evolution of whales has become one of the most frequently cited examples of large-scale evolutionary change. When we look at introductory biology textbooks, we often see whale fossils cited as a great example of large-scale evolution. There are review articles written for educational or outreach-oriented journals that talk about whales as a poster child for macroevolution, for instance. Or we could go to the frequently asked questions sections of different websites, including biologos.org, that cite the fossil record of whales as a really compelling example of evolution. Because of this, whale evolution has also frequently been discussed by creationist ministries as well, who are against the idea of large-scale evolutionary change. Some of these critiques, I would say, could be regarded as fairly substantive in nature, but others, as you can see from this quote and some of these cartoons here, lack substance a little bit, stooping maybe to making this sound just really absurd to question the veracity of these scientific claims. And so for me, as a person who studies these organisms, now more than ever, it's important for me to help people understand the type of evidence that's out there, especially in this particular case, because, of all the things that I know a little bit about as a scientist and as a biologist, the early evolution of whales is the thing that I know the most about. And in many ways, I think it is indeed an ideal case study for us to discuss when looking at the types of evidence that are out there for these really large-scale evolutionary changes. So we'll start with this simple question. What is a whale? Now, if I was sitting in a crowd of people, I would ask for some responses from the audience, but I'll just let you ponder this for a moment. You'll probably realize that there are a lot of different ways that you could answer this question. But one answer I always emphasize with students and with groups that I'm talking to is that whales are mammals. Right? I could probably give a whole lecture if you want on just how, looking at the skeleton, we know whales are mammals. There's all sorts of characteristics that tell us that. But there's all these other traits as well, right? They feed their young with milk from mammary glands. That's where the term mammal comes from. Whales have lungs, and they need to breathe oxygen out of the atmosphere. They have live birth with a placenta. They're endothermic and homeothermic, so they generate their own body heat and keep it pretty high. They develop hair, and I'm not talking baleen here. I'm actually talking little vibrissae, little whiskers on the snouts of some species. They've got very large brains like most mammals do, and so on, right? So we know that whales are mammals, but beyond that simple fact, whales are secondarily aquatic mammals, and that's where I think things get interesting. Now, what in the world do I mean by secondarily aquatic? Well, if I asked you to brainstorm for me a bunch of the different mammals that you know, you would probably think of a mammal that's terrestrial. So I've included some of my favorite terrestrial mammals here, right? This is my dog, Ozzy. You can see him sitting in the car ready to go for a hike. Here's a wolverine, go blue. I'm a University of Michigan alum, right? So, You would probably think of a whole bunch of different terrestrial mammals if I asked you to think about that. But some of you may realize that there are actually a handful of mammals that are adapted in various ways for life in the water. We could talk about otters, which are basically aquatic weasels. We could talk about pinnipeds. Pinnipeds are the group that includes sea lions, seals, and walruses, and they're derived from a different group of carnivores than otters are. We could think about the sirenians. The sirenians include manatees and dugongs as well. These are all different aquatic mammals that are adapted for life in the water despite having ancestors that lived on land. Now, I would argue that there are no mammals that are as specialized for aquatic life as whales. Now, I've been using this word cetacean and whales kind of interchangeably, but we could probably be a little more careful if we wanted to. The order Cetacea, right, includes modern whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And that term is derived from the Latin word cetus, which means whales. And we divide that up into two groups. The odontocetes, you break that down, odonto is tooth, cete is whale. So these are the toothed whales. That includes dolphins, that includes porpoises, that includes narwhals and belugas and sperm whales. And then we have the mysticetes. We often call these baleen whales, but if we want to break that word down, misty means mustache. So these are the mustached whales. And that's referring to the fact that they have these plates of hair-like structures called baleen in their oral cavities that they use to filter shrimp and krill and other small critters out of the water. Regardless of what kind of whale we look at, they are all well adapted for life in water. We can just look externally at a bottlenose dolphin here and see that there is a host of features that demonstrate how well adapted for aquatic life they are. They've got this short, stiff neck that actually allows them to like fuse their body in with the rest, or fuse their head in with the rest of their body to give them a nice streamlined body shape. We actually don't have any external hind limbs either that allows for streamlining. And we've got this horizontally flattened tail fluke back here that they can move up and down through the water to propel them forward. They've got a dorsal fin and their arms shaped into flippers that allow them to steer and control themselves in the water. And then one of my favorite features, they've got a blowhole. They've got a set of nostrils on the top of their head. So all they have to do to get a breath of fresh air from the air is to stick the top of their head out of water and take a big deep breath, and they can go back down again. Plus, there's a whole host of internal features and physiological mechanisms that we could think about that enable them to be well adapted for aquatic life as well. Clearly, when you compare an animal like that to an animal that lives on land like this pronghorn antelope, you can see that the demands for living on land and living in water are vastly different from one another. So an animal that's well adapted for life on land is typically poorly adapted for life in water, and vice versa. This presents a really interesting problem for animals like whales from an evolutionary standpoint. The fossil record clearly indicates that the first mammals were animals that lived on land. So if all mammals are descended from a common mammal ancestor, as posited by evolutionary theory, then that implies that all aquatic mammals, right, like cetaceans, sirenians, seals, and sea lions, those animals must have evolved from ancestors that lived on land. And that's a transition that would have required this drastic change from one distinct way of life to another, requiring a virtual overhaul in anatomy and physiology. So what kind of evidence is there that that type of evolutionary transition occurred? Well, for a lot of years, it was a major mystery. So let's go back to Darwin. If you've ever read the first edition of On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, Darwin clearly recognized that what his theory implied for animals like whales. And in chapter 6, he actually speculates about how creatures like cetaceans might have evolved. So I'll read this quote quickly. In North America, the black bear was seen by Hearn, who was a naturalist, swimming for hours with widely open mouth, thus catching like a whale insects in the water. Even in so extreme a case as this, if supply of insects were constant and if better adapted competitors did not already exist in the country, I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their structures and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. So that was 1859. And apparently Darwin was ridiculed for this remark. And if you look at subsequent editions of On the Origin of Species, he actually removed a lot of this passage and shortened it very briefly. But it just goes to show that as soon as he proposed evolution by natural selection, he was thinking about how creatures like whales might have arisen. But for over a century after Darwin wrote this, exactly how this transition might have occurred was a major mystery, even for the most renowned paleontologists in the world, mainly because there wasn't any direct fossil evidence to document the hypothetical intermediate species that would have needed to bridge the gap between fully aquatic whales and their ancestors living on land. In 1936, a scientist at the Smithsonian Institution named Remington Kellogg published this massive monograph called A Review of the Archaeoceti. Archaeoceti means ancient whale. And in this monograph, he actually described every single fossil whale that was known at the time. And this included a number of species from the Gulf Coast of North America, but also some fossils that had been described in Egypt as well. So you see two examples here that are actually known from North America, Zygorrhiza and Basilosaurus. And these are clearly fully aquatic animals, right? When you look at their basic skeleton, it's not all that different than what we see in modern whales. But you might notice that there are these little rudimentary hind limb bones. These had actually been found at this point for Basilosaurus, and they postulated that they existed for Zygorrhiza, even though they hadn't yet been discovered at that point in time. Okay, so that's maybe a little bit interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about where those elements came from in just a few minutes. But even moving forward another decade, all right, it's the middle of the 20th century, the origin of whales still had the best scientists stumped. This is G.G. Simpson. So he was a paleontologist, probably the greatest paleontologist, at least in the first half of the 20th century in the US. And he played a really critical role in the modern synthesis, kind of melding evolution by natural selection with paleontology and other disciplines. And in his book about the classification of mammals, he says that the place in the sequence of cohorts and orders of mammalian classification for cetaceans is open to question and is indeed quite impossible to determine in any purely objective way. So he's saying we have no idea how whales are related to other mammals. Eventually, that would change, okay? And much of the understanding we have of cetacean evolution today has really come out of work since the 1970s, and that's where the work of my PhD advisor, Philip Gingrich, really started to come into play. So Philip started to do field work in Pakistan in the late 1970s, and during a field season there, he found this fossil. Okay, so this is a partial skull with some teeth, with part of a lower jaw. And this represents the remains of one of the earliest known cetaceans called Pakicetus. It was found in some river sediments about 50 million years old. And you might look at that and wonder, well, how in the world do we identify this as a cetacean? Well, the clinching features have to do with the anatomy of the ear. Okay, there are certain features in the ear that allow modern cetaceans to actually hear underwater very well. And we don't see those features in any other mammals. Yet when we compare the ear of a modern whale with the ear of Basilosaurus, with the ear of Pakicetus, we see some of these same features. So that's what helps us to understand that this creature was likely a whale. So this was big news. It made the cover of the journal Science, and you can see that they reconstructed this amphibious fish-eating predator out of a fossil that had a partial skull and some teeth, right? So not best practices, I don't think, for paleontologists to reconstruct a whole animal from just a couple of bits. But I know that Philip probably wasn't thrilled with this either. He wanted to go back to Pakistan to find a more complete skeleton, so we really understood more what that animal was like. But soon after this was published, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and that made it so that Americans couldn't do field work in Pakistan for quite a while after that. At that point, Philip had whales on the brain. He wanted to dig into this and understand more about how whales originated, and he found some of this previous work that German paleontologists had done in the late 1800s, documenting this place in Egypt where they'd found some of these whale fossils. Now, you might be wondering why in the world we find early whale fossils in places like the mountains of Pakistan and the deserts of Egypt. Well, if we go back to the Eocene epoch about 50 million years ago, the age of Pakicetus, you can see that Africa hadn't yet bumped up into Eurasia, nor had the Indian subcontinent bumped up into Asia yet either. And so you have this seaway here, what we call the Tethys Sea, passing between the modern day Indian Ocean and the modern day Atlantic Ocean. And Pakistan and India, Egypt, these were all underwater at that time. So it would make sense for us to see some of the earliest cetaceans in this part of the world. As I mentioned earlier, I had the amazing, life-changing opportunity to actually do field work in this place in Egypt called Wadi al-Hitan, which is Arabic for Valley of Whales. And this is a picture I took looking at the southern part of the valley when I did field work there back in 2009. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site that you can visit. It's about 150 kilometers southwest of Cairo in the eastern part of the Sahara Desert. If you're ever in Egypt, I definitely think it's worth hiring a driver and spending a day to drive down here from Cairo. 40 to 50 million years ago, this was a shallow sea. And these German paleontologists in the late 19th century had actually discovered some of the first whale fossils here. And Philip sort of resumed that work in the 1980s. So there was like a span of 75, 80 years when no one was doing field work here because it was so remote. And thanks to the work of Philip and his collaborators over many years, this place has become famous for both its quantity and quality of fossils. So I'll just tell you one little story there to help you understand just how amazing this place is. So we had a writer and two photographers from National Geographic with us for part of the field season that I was there. And there was one evening when we went out to look for a particular fossil that somebody had reported finding. So if you look in this image here, I'm standing at the bottom of a sandy slope. And up here at the top, you can see the National Geographic guys. And so they're waiting for the rest of us to get up there. And so I started to walk up this slope after taking the picture. And what you're doing when you're out on a fossil expedition is you're looking for bone. And so everywhere I'm looking, I'm seeing if I find bone. And as I'm walking up this slope, I'm seeing little bits of bone everywhere. I'll see a little phalanx, a little finger bone here that I'll pick up. And I'll walk a little further and find a part of a rib that I'll pick up. And I'll walk a little farther and find part of a humerus that I might pick up. And you get up to the top of that sandy slope, and you see an entire whale skeleton eroding out of a sandstone cliff, right? So you're seeing a lower jaw here with teeth. The skull is turned on its side with the upper teeth showing. The body goes into the cliff and then bends around, and you see ribs and vertebrae eroding out on the other side. And this has probably been sitting here eroding for decades, if not a century, just with bones breaking off and sliding down this slope. Not every specimen here is quite as gorgeous or as intact or complete as this, but over the years that University of Michigan teams did field work here, they mapped something like 1,500 different individual whale specimens in a relatively limited area. The skeletons are everywhere there. This is another example where we just encountered some teeth sticking out of a hillside, and we spent the better part of a week kind of digging in here and found the whole front half of a Basilosaurus skeleton there. So this is a 50 to 60 foot long whale whose entire body was encased within this gypsified shale that was here. This particular species of whale is similar to the one that was known from North America from the early 20th century, but this is a particularly Egyptian species, Basilosaurus isis. And when it was first uncovered in Egypt by Philip and his colleagues in the late 80s and early 90s, they discovered that not only did it have some hind limb elements, it had fully formed hind limb elements. It had a pelvis with a femur and a kneecap and a tibia and a fibula, ankle bones, and little toes on it. Yet these were tiny compared to the overall length of this whale. So the limbs were fully formed, but presumably not being used for walking at all because they could never have supported the weight of this animal. And they were actually detached from the spine, so there was no way of transmitting body weight to those limbs anyway. But what is really important for the discovery of this particular whale with the discovery of Pakicetus earlier was that it sets up some boundaries on where we can look for some of these fossils. Okay, so Basilosaurus is dated to about 37 million years old in Egypt. Pakicetus is dated to about 50 million years old in Pakistan. And that gives us a 13 million year window during which whales were presumably changing from being fairly terrestrial with some aquatic adaptations to fully aquatic, like we see in Basilosaurus. And so what you can do then is you can look for rocks that are exposed that are of this particular age. You can look for environments that are shallow marine environments and things like that. So you can start to pinpoint where you might find fossils to actually help to fill this gap. So by the early 90s, the Cold War was over. That allowed Americans to go back and do fieldwork in Pakistan again. So Philip started to do fieldwork there, along with one of his former students named Hans Tavison. And independently, they started to uncover some really remarkable specimens. So the top four, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Myocetus, and Rhodocetus, are all cetaceans that were recovered from these efforts in India and Pakistan. Dorodon is one of our whales from Egypt that had been known for quite a while. And all I've done here is arrange these fossils by their age and their inferred phylogenetic relationships. And you can see that there's a clear trend of increasing aquatic adaptations in the more recent fossils. Without going into detail, we could look at virtually any aspect of the skeleton here, and I could sort of document the types of changes that we are seeing in their skeletons that are allowing these animals to become more and more aquatic. One of my favorites that I think is easy to see is the evolution of the blowhole. So this is a photo that my friend Matthew Campbell took at the Mace Brown Museum of Natural History in Charleston, South Carolina, and sent with me a few years back, where you can see the position of the nostrils in these different whales, right? Georgiocetus, Zygorrhiza, and so on, moving farther and farther back on the skull as we move forward through time, right? So just kind of a cool example of one particular feature changing with time. Now, admittedly, when we look at a tree like this, I know that this is an oversimplification because there are actually like 60 some species that we now know of that help to bridge this transition. I'm only showing you 5 of them here. And the vast majority of these have been discovered in the past 40 years. We even see all kinds of interesting specializations happening within different groups where animals are clearly experimenting with kind of a unique way of making a living in the ocean. But even if we were to include all of these, this greater diversity in here, we would still be able to see these general anatomical trends still readily apparent. But this is also a very small part of the cetacean fossil record. Okay, the organisms that I specialize on, we usually sort of lay them out in these 5 or 6 different families that you can see here. And they are excluded from a group that we call Neoceti. Neoceti is the group that includes modern toothed whales, modern baleen whales, and all of the fossil whales that are more closely related to them than they are to anything else. And we're summarizing that whole group of whales in one little bar here. If we were to expand that and look at different families, it would look like this. We've got whole hosts of families of ancient whales that are more recent than the whales I work on that are fully extinct. All of our modern whales that still exist today have black bars that go to the top of these images. All of these bars down here are fully extinct groups that were doing all kinds of interesting and unique things in the world's oceans. Okay, and I don't even have any time to get to that at all. So hopefully you can see like this is the stuff that I really geek out about, right? I love thinking through these fossils, looking at their anatomy, trying to understand how their anatomy was changing through time and what that means for their way of life. But the fossils actually tell us more than just about changes in anatomy as well. So we could look at the geology, right? We could look at the paleo environments where we find these fossils. And if we just look at the simple lithology, we see a trend. We see the oldest, most primitive cetaceans found in river sediments and freshwater sediments. And then we start to see some of these other cetaceans found in coastal environments, found in nearshore marine environments. And by the time we get to our first fully aquatic whales, they're found in these offshore marine environments too. So this is kind of exactly the progression we would expect in terms of the depositional environments as these animals are going from land to sea. We can also look at chemistry here. We can look at the stable isotopes of things like oxygen in their teeth and bones. I don't want to get into too much detail here given time constraints, but basically there are different isotopes of oxygen. And because of the way that the water cycle works, salt water has a higher percentage of heavy oxygen than fresh water does. And whatever water animals are living in and ingesting, that oxygen will eventually get incorporated into their teeth and bones. So we can take samples from teeth of fossils and compare how much of the heavy oxygen there is in their teeth. And that can actually tell us where they were spending time. And what do we see here? Well, we see our earliest cetaceans indicate that they're almost all freshwater. And as we work our way forward through the cetacean family tree, we see that they're starting to incorporate more and more heavy oxygen into their teeth and bones, which suggests that they were spending all of their time in salt water, right? So these are actually two completely independent lines of evidence that are telling us the same thing, right? About where these animals were and the type of progression they were making between these different environments. How about biogeography, right? Thinking about where we find these fossils is also telling. So you saw this picture already of the rough position of the continents during the Eocene when some of these fossils are known. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to map for you where these different groups of fossils are found. So our most primitive fossils, the pachycetids, the one that were least adapted for aquatic life, those are only known from India and Pakistan. The next group up, the ambulocetids, that includes Ambulocetus, the walking whale. These are a bit more adapted for life in the water, but they're also only known from Pakistan. The group that I specialized on for my PhD, a group called Remingtonocetids, when I started my work, they had only been known from India and Pakistan. But in 2015, some colleagues and I described the first known species of Remingtonocetid from Egypt. So now we actually see them getting into North Africa. The Protocetids were roughly contemporaneous with the Remingtonocetids, but had a much broader geographic distribution. We find them throughout India and Pakistan, but also in multiple places in Africa, in the Southeast US, and in places like Peru and South America. And then our first fully aquatic cetaceans, the basilosaurids, are found all over the world, including places like Antarctica and New Zealand as well. So this distribution is exactly what we would expect to see in a land-to-sea transition, right? The earliest forms that were least adapted for life in water have limited swimming capabilities, and they can't disperse very far from their point of origin, which we think was India and Pakistan. But as these different groups became increasingly adapted for life in water, we see them able to disperse farther and farther and farther from their point of origin. So the fossil record, right, the thing that I know best, tells us more about this transition than we often give it credit for. But other fields can speak into the origin of cetaceans here as well. So we can talk about additional evidence from simple comparative anatomy, right, looking at the anatomies of modern forms. When I teach comparative anatomy, I love putting a dolphin skull out on my lab quizzes because that shows the students who really understand well the relationships of all the cranial bones. But despite the fact that cetaceans like this dolphin have what's called a telescoped skull, where these bones are kind of overlapping on one another like an old school spyglass, all of the same bones are present in a dolphin skull as are present in something like a gray fox or a dog or even a human. Okay? We could even look at things like vertebrae as well. This is a part of the body that I've spent most of my research on with some of these fossil whales. And despite the fact that modern cetaceans have tried to eliminate their neck basically to allow them to have this streamlined body shape and not having to use a lot of muscle control to steady the head during swimming, cetaceans still have the same number of cervical vertebrae as all mammals do, right? They have 7. They've just all shortened up a lot and often become fused together into 1 or 2 different blocks of bone to actually stabilize things. We could look at the flippers, right, and see that not only do we have some of the same elements between the flipper of a generic whale and the flipper of something like a cat, but even when we have different fin shapes among different whales, we still see this same underlying architecture, even as they're using these fins very differently from one another. So for me, even in the absence of fossils, when we look at this underlying architecture being so similar among cetaceans, but also between cetaceans and other mammals, for me, that speaks to common ancestry being a really compelling explanation for that as well. We could talk about development, right? What happens with those hind limbs that we see lost in cetaceans as it became adapted for life in water? Well, we can learn a little bit about that as we study the development of modern cetaceans. So we can see in images of these dolphin embryos that hind limb buds actually start to form during the early stages of development in these animals. And that initial limb growth really looks almost exactly like hind limb development in other amniotes and other mammals using even the same signaling pathways. But the normal sequence of gene expression gets disrupted. And so a signal that's necessary for hind limb development gets shut off prematurely, and that causes these hind limb buds to stop developing. And the rest of the embryo kind of grows around it, so you eventually see those limb buds subsumed into the rest of the embryo. Yet interestingly, we still see vestiges of this initial development in the adult body of these animals as well. So most modern cetaceans actually have some bony elements that are present in the body wall where that hind limb bud initially developed. And there are even some very rare cases, like this dolphin that was caught off the coast of Japan in 2006, where development somehow proceeded a little bit longer and you actually get external hind appendages that actually still have bones inside as well. So for me, this kind of information is strongly suggestive of this ancient terrestrial ancestry for cetaceans. We could talk about genetics here as well. And we see some very interesting things that are suggestive of terrestrial ancestry when we look at the genes and genomes of cetaceans. One of my favorite examples involves smell, or what we often call olfaction, when we're talking about anatomy and physiology. This is one of many sensory changes that happen during the origin of cetaceans. We see that you probably know that most mammals have very well developed olfactory systems with hundreds of genes that code for different receptors for odorant molecules that they can pick up from the air. But we've known for some time that the olfactory system in cetaceans is either drastically reduced in some species or completely absent. And I guess that makes sense, right? Because picking up airborne molecules doesn't have too much relevance for animals living underwater. And if you've ever tried sniffing things underwater, you probably realize that that doesn't work very well either, right? So olfactory systems of mammals are not set up well for that. But interestingly, when we look at the genomes of cetaceans, we can detect olfactory receptor genes. But most of them have become pseudogenes. So they look like ordinary genes. We see the proper sequences for the promoters and operators and things like that, but they've acquired one or more mutations that actually prevent them from being properly expressed, right? So that's what we mean by a pseudogene. We recognize it's a genetic sequence of a gene, but it is not functioning anymore. What's really cool is that we can compare some of these pseudogenes in cetaceans with olfactory receptor genes in animals like cows, and we can actually pinpoint where the genetic mutations are. Like we can get to the base pair level of DNA, see where the mutations are, and actually understand what changes that would have had for the gene. We can even map those changes onto trees of different species of whales and figure out when in the history of these groups these different mutations actually arose. So when I see some data like that, it is really hard for me to account for some of that information without using evolution and common ancestry as a key factor there. We could talk about other examples of genetic things as well. I'll just mention these very, very briefly, and we can come back to them in the Q&A if we have time. So just like olfaction doesn't work very well in cetaceans, gustation, the sense of taste, doesn't work very well either. And we see a drastic reduction in the number of genes for taste receptors. And again, we can pinpoint where those mutations are by comparing them with those same genes in artiodactyl mammals, hoofed mammals. And we can again see when different mutations arose. We can see why things have become pseudogenes. We can even look in baleen whales that don't have teeth, and we can find genes for things like enamel, right? So that they can build some of the proteins and things that are responsible for tooth development, even when they don't have functional teeth. But again, most of these genes have been degraded into pseudogenes, okay? So there are many different kinds of genetic examples that we could talk about here. And certainly there are some aspects of anatomy and development that we would probably trace the genetic changes as well. But our knowledge of genomics, especially just in the past couple of decades, has helped to give us additional evidence for evolutionary change that goes well beyond this readily available physical characteristics that we can easily see in a lot of these different organisms. So, to summarize and get us to our second Q&A session, the evidence for the evolution of cetaceans from animals that lived on land comes from a variety of different fields, right? We talked about how fossil cetaceans have intermediate anatomies, like we would expect, and they appear both when temporally and where geographically and geologically we would expect to find them. Comparative anatomy and development help us to see these striking similarities between cetaceans and terrestrial mammals that might be hard to account for otherwise. And genetics allow us insights into the molecular basis of some of these changes to understand how they happened at these just absolutely incredible levels of detail. And so for me, this is what makes evolution so compelling, right? That we can have these different independent lines of evidence all converging on one basic explanation, and that's that cetaceans almost certainly arose from ancestors that lived on land, right? I'll be the first to admit that there's still a lot to learn here, right? Like even in this example, there's still open questions. There are still things for us to figure out. But I hope that working through some of the examples that I worked through here tonight, that helps you to see why cetaceans have gone from one of evolution's biggest mysteries to one of evolution's most shining examples. So that'll move us into our second Q&A here, and I can't resist showing just a few of my favorite cetacean cartoons, right, that give me a good chuckle when I see them. So I'll leave these up for at least the start of our Q&A. But I hope that that was an interesting spin through the world of cetaceans and also helped give you more appreciation for where a lot of the evidence for evolution and common descent comes from.
Thank you, Ryan, for that background on evidence for evolution, especially with regard to the cetacean lineage. So we'll now begin a 10 to 15 minute Q&A period. There haven't been really very many questions since the first half. But let me ask you this. I know that getting DNA out of fossils is extremely difficult. Has there been any attempt to do that with cetacean fossils at all, and any success in getting any DNA sequence data out of these cetacean fossils?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am not aware of anyone who has been able to extract DNA from cetaceans yet, but I think that our approach and our technology is probably only getting better. So I think it's probably only a matter of time before we're actually able to do that. Folks are probably aware of, some of the soft tissue that has been able to be recovered from things like dinosaurs. And folks are aware that some of the more recent fossils that we have access to, things like mammoths and mastodons and things like that, they've had better success extracting DNA from things like that. Certainly, the farther you go back in time, the more degraded that DNA can be. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that at some point we'll be able to get some DNA from creatures like this to help us understand a little bit more, maybe even about how some of these different species are related to one another. It's interesting that some of the first hints, I didn't get to talk about this during the presentation just due to time, but some of the first hints that whales were adapted to, or were related to artiodactyls, the even-toed ungulates like deer and pigs and cows and hippos, actually came from molecular biologists in the 1950s who were looking at proteins within the blood and just looking over at overall similarity between the proteins. And they were able to see that the proteins in the plasma of cetaceans was most similar to the artiodactyls. And we now know from DNA comparing cetaceans and mammals that it's the hippos that are actually the group that is the most closely related to modern cetaceans.
So if you were to take individual genes from extant cetaceans, you would see and do a sequence similarity search. You would see hippos show up as being similar for at least some genes.
Yeah, yeah. I'd suspect the overall genetic similarity for sure. Um,
Hmm.
and we now know. I mean, there was some question as to whether or not cetaceans and artiodactyls were what we'd call sister groups, right? So
Mhm.
they're both their own groups, but they're closely related to one another more so than they are to other things. But the genetics actually tell us that cetaceans are nested within artiodactyls. So this is a place where genetics has actually changed our taxonomy a little bit. If I'm being really careful with my language, cetaceans actually are artiodactyls, right? They are highly modified, specialized aquatic artiodactyls. And the DNA tells us that. So hippos are more closely related to cetaceans than they actually are to other artiodactyls, right? That's what the DNA actually tells us.
And is there any genetic evidence for like seeing transposons or ancient viruses in the same place for artiodactyls and cetaceans?
I don't know that offhand, but I would suspect that's almost certainly the case. Yep.
Okay. Any other questions that anybody has? I might go back to a question that was asked in the first half, and it relates to information content in genomes. And the question is, considering the information in genomes, would you say that the kind of information here in terms of chemical interactions of nucleotides is different than what we would call information?
I mean that's a question that I struggle with a little bit, just because I think about and people could maybe disagree with well, people could certainly disagree with me on this. Um, but when I see trying to wrestle with trying to understand the genetic code and then the transmission of information, if we're using that term from one generation to the next. I worry about sort of our metaphors for like informatics, thinking about computers, thinking about things like that. I worry about our metaphors breaking down a little bit. Um, and so I'm always kind of, I'll admit to being a little bit befuddled with how to handle questions about information like that, Brian.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Here's another one. Great to hear about the use of genes to establish common ancestry. Have there been studies of developmental genes that help to describe the developmental changes in cetaceans?
Yeah, so there actually have been a number of studies that have looked at some of those things. Um, Hind limb development is one of the best ones, and so this was some work that's man, it's probably 20 years old already now, where they looked at, and I mentioned this earlier, they looked at some of these different pathways for hind limb loss, and they're looking at trying to understand the types of genetic changes that resulted in developmental changes that cause these hind limbs to stop developing in different organisms. And so that's where, using a field like Evo Devo is really going to help us understand how these types of things can happen, because it's sometimes not even necessarily needing a new gene that codes for a new protein that can result in a really profound change in an organism. It can simply be turning off a genetic program
Exactly.
too soon or
Right.
letting one run longer than it would have otherwise. And just the simple change in the timing of those developmental programs can have really profound effects with the organisms. So I know like the example that I know best is the limb development in the cetaceans, because limb function is something that I've looked at a little bit. But I would suspect there's other papers out there as well that are looking at different aspects of that development as well.
Well, we really need to bring this webinar to a close. I want to thank Ryan Beebe again for being our keynote speaker this evening, and thank you all for joining us for this presentation of the affiliation of Christian biologists and the American Scientific Affiliation. Stay tuned for future announcements about upcoming events in our series on evolution and creation. Our next event is scheduled for December 11th and will feature Bible scholar and theologian John Walton, who will talk about what the Bible really says about creation. If you're interested in getting more information about the ACB or the parent organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, send us an email at asa@asa3.org. Again, that's ASA at ASA3, the number 3.org. As we close out this evening in prayer, I'd like to ask Sarah Gall, the webmaster of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists, to lead us in prayer.
Please join me in prayer. Father God, we praise you for the wonderful creation you've made and for your work through time to bring all of this wondrous diversity of life to fruition. We thank you for the opportunity that we have as scientists to study the work of your hands and to learn some about you as creator and the ways that you have brought this world and its diversity to this point. We thank you for the presentation this evening. We ask that you bless Ryan and the work that he is continuing to do. And we thank you for groups like the ASA and the Affiliation of Christian Biologists, where scientists of faith can work and worship in common with others who seek to glorify you, and where we can wrestle with questions of science and faith. We ask that you bless our conversations with others as we seek after truth and seek to glorify your name. Bless us as we go forth from here this evening. Give us rest for tomorrow and guide us in your path in our work and life. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. If you're not on the ACB mailing list and you want to become a member of the ACB. And be sure to check out the ACB group pages on Facebook and LinkedIn. Good night, everyone. Until next time.